In a climate-controlled archive, a conservator sets a micrometer to 0.035 millimeters and gently presses it against a translucent sliver of onion skin paper. The sheet, delicate as a dragonfly wing, rustles with the faintest hiss, and under lamplight, its fibers show a pale honeyed grain. The note seems ordinary, a request about a thoroughbred's feed ration, a mention of a saddle order, the soft business of stables. Under a loop, however, there is the smallest dot, less than the head of a pin, embedded near a flourish of ink, masked by the scent of old glue and dust. The dot is a microphotograph, and within it sit maps, names, coordinates. The myth repeats that spies belong to shadow, that they vanish into alleys and shuttered rooms, yet this evidence glows under bright glass from a world of clinking glasses, polished boots, and afternoon racecourses. The legend insists on darkness, the measurement says otherwise, and the paper remembers the pressure of his hand. If the onion skins hush, the micrometer at 0.35 millimeters, and the pinprick world glowing under bright glass feel like a slow breath before the stable's amber evening, subscribe. A stable late in the day holds a hushed amber light, dust blooming around each footstep like a soft exhale. Leather darkens where oil has been rubbed into it, the smell warm and nutty, and a bridle lies across a felted saddle pad with a faint squeak. A groom hums to himself, weaving a loose tail. Swallows trace quiet arcs just under the rafters. Near an open door, where the corridor smells of grain and sun-warmed hay, a man stands with one hand on a stall door, posture easy, white shirt sleeves rolled and clean. In his eyes, the reflective sheen of someone accustomed to listening before speaking. The horse's breath pulls in the cool shade, a slow fog and a fly taps the wood. In this light, the hard edges blur, and everything feels like continuity, polite laughter, a handshake, the scrape of a boot on packed earth. Wolfgang Lotz flicks a speck of straw from his cuff and smiles. At the city's Island Club, a membership ledger balanced in neat columns smells faintly of binding paste and a lifetime of sweat-damp hands. The horses turn the dirt of the training ring into a soft drumbeat as they circle. Reins whisper through fingers, and sunlight breaks against the silver of a bit. Here, Wolfgang's German accent lands like a polished coin on an oak table, familiar, clean, and useful to those who share the same past or wish they did. He trades horse talk with calm precision, recalling the precise mouth-feel of a snaffle, the weight of a saddle tree, the precise diameter of a martingale ring. Each concrete detail is the lever that lifts heavier intelligence. A purchaser enters with polished boots and a cologne that clings to the air. He leaves with an invitation, a time, a bottle waiting on ice. The echo of hooves becomes a ledger of influence, and the measure of the day is counted not in laps, but in trust. Some lives are scaled in maps or medals. His was scaled in textures, in the way linen cooled against his neck at dusk, in the cadence of foreign small talk polished to a satiny sheen. He had learned to tilt his head at the right beat, to let a silence lengthen until it felt like sympathy and not suspicion, to let laughter fall like feathers and then melt away. In the stable yard, he would lift a halter and check the stitching with careful fingers, as if repair mattered more than gossip, as if hay dust on his sleeve held the day's deepest news. The myth says spies avoid light. He proved that in certain eras, a salon's glare is an invisibility cloak. The hand that raises a champagne flute can also count steps to a guarded gate. And as evening breathed through jasmine, the city's secrets drifted close, warmed by hospitality and the illusion of safety. The sand remembers. Instruments hum. The hollow waits. A letter on onion skin once glided through the mail with a subtle perfume of office ink and glue, the fold crisp, the staples squared with neat pressure. To the postal clerk it was another business note about feed blends or a request for horse transport after a show. Yet beneath the curlicues of formal German, Wolfgang's pen paused at the end of certain phrases, a pause that signalled where a microdot sat, varnished into place with a thin gloss of collodion. Under ultraviolet, Lab technicians later saw how the varnish carried a whisper of sheen, and a trained fingernail could find the slightest burr. In the lab, a camera lens trained across a high-contrast field, the microdot opened into an address list and a map with a faint grid-sealed hangars, a test pad, a convoy route. The paper was a handkerchief against the noise of a whole city. It absorbed everything without stain, carrying news between the ticks of a wall clock. He sat in noisy gardens near fountains where the water sounded like breathing layered over breathing, and learned to drop a detail casually, to invite one in return, to let laughter cut through suspicion's membrane like something bright through the surface of a pond. There is a surer way to pass unnoticed than being unmemorable. Be desirable company. Be the host who serves the fine bottle. Be the man who remembers a name before it is offered. He let a rumour dock itself lightly on his sleeve and did not brush it off. He let men confess their fatigue in the warm glow of his lamp. A myth says, silence is the spy's only instrument. He tuned the room instead, made it resonate, and listened to the overtone. How else could a single life translate gossip into a force that moved military planners and shifted the dense geometry of fear? In the desert, wind carries a powder of gypsum that tastes faintly of chalk on the tongue, and a straight road goes out toward a flat horizon where a test stand throws a ladder of concrete shadows across the afternoon. There, engineers with rolled sleeves moved among crates, the wood still perfumed with tar and the metallic tang of hidden tools. Blueprints smudged with graphite described the clean mathematics of thrust, the crisp arc of trajectories. In the withered grass near Helwan's urban edge and other places where dust swallows boot prints by morning, rumours of rockets gilded conversation in Cairo's coffeehouses. Wolfgang made those rumours measurable. He mapped social orders. This man was recruited in a cafe with fans that ticked. That man's pay came via a firm whose typing pool smelled of carbon ribbon and cigarettes. He marked which hangar had new locks, which truck tarps showed fresh resin stains. With patience, the desert's silence became a coordinate system. When the sky cracked with a far-off report like a book spine opened too violently, the city felt it in a tremor lived as gossip and caution. A groundskeeper heard it beneath the tapping of a rake's prongs on gravel. A groom glanced up from a hoof rasp, his own rhythm suddenly too loud. The myth leaned in, expecting trench coats and alleys, yet the work ripened in verandas where fans chopped the heat into manageable breezes. He softened his consonants just enough to match another man's childhood, and then let that man believe the encounter had confirmed something about himself. The central motif returns in each pause. In certain ages, you measure not distances but densities. The concentration of loyalties in a room, the compression of fear in an official's laugh. Even the clink of a teaspoon becomes a ruler against a table's edge. In these rooms, the way eyes drift measures risk. The scent of cognac measures candor. The night breathes out. The desk lamp pulls gold. Footsteps pause, then pass. Friends visited his apartment where ice chimed in glasses and waxed floors glowed. There were ashtrays heavy as paperweights. An ice bucket radiated a small chill into the air, and a radio cabinet stood quiet, a piece of furniture like another. In the wall behind, a hidden cavity held the logic of a much colder world. He had rehearsed each motion until it was muscle, a cigarette placed on the rim of a bowl as if forgotten, a cuff adjusted to move a lever without a click, a shutter closed so the pinprick of a pilot lamp could not bleed into the night. Grouped numbers went out like a lullaby sung in a language the city could not pass, and the antenna wire trembled, feeling the dark. Radio direction vans later would learn the song's true path, but for a season, the signal rode the rooftops like a moth seeking another moth. The apartment's air carried both perfume and metal. At the table, 4 place settings clinked, not just with dishes, but with carefully staged chants. A name dropped softly into a story. About paddocks rose later like yeast. An anecdote, salted deftly, preserved a boast until it could be served back to headquarters in a different form. His hands touched a wine label. His fingers traced the raised letters. and he understood that a brand known to a guest would soften that guest's throat when the talk shifted toward airfields, subcontractors, the odd absence of certain engineers one week, and their bleary Saturdays when tests ran late. In humid kitchens behind, the sharp, consoling scent of lemon cut through the room, suggesting that everything unpleasant could be cleaned. The work was not clean, yet he kept the tone gentle, the door open, the napkins folded. Was this extravagance, or a technique as precise as a knife edge used to lift a varnished dot? In safe flats and borrowed rooms, handlers crinkled paper with a particular caution, as if sound itself could be indexed and replayed. The rooms smelled of carbon paper, instant coffee grainy at the bottom of mugs, and cheap soap fighting vainly against Cairo's dust. He learned a discipline of timing that made him earlier or later than expected by an amount that never repeated, a rhythm you could hum but never mirror. His notes came home disguised as lists of oats and shoeing. His microdots did not crowd a single sheet, but balanced across mundane lines to avoid pattern. He passed a dead drop in the shadow of a wall perfumed by sun-warmed stone, the package nested in a hollow shaped by a hand gloved in patience. In those days, tradecraft prized the grey man. He added colour, and the palette expanded. Power emerged not just from what he knew, but how he made knowledge plausible. Even night air holds witness. The hum of a city never truly sleeps. Scooters thread alleys that smell of bread and oil, and somewhere a spindle of wire in a van listens on the move. He adjusted, reduced transmissions, then refused the paring away that would unmake his cover. A net slowly brightened where he had seen only currents. A stranger's glance lingered a fraction longer in a cafe. A driver's friendly wave shifted by a degree. He noticed, and the noticing was another instrument he could not put down. In this era, discovery came mirrored by suppression. Reports that once flowed now pooled, and in the pooling there was reflection enough to see himself. Silence held its breath, and the myth about shadows began to flash its teeth, less legend than procedure. Even the smell of dust changed, as fear seasons the air like cumin, faint yet present, a spice that marks a different kitchen and a different meal. Curtains stir. The key turns. The breathing changes. Interrogation rooms do not shout, they persist. Tile cools the bones through a chair's four legs, an overhead bulb hums, a thin cup of water sweats, and windows frame nothing useful. Everything is measured, the scrape of a chair, the cracking of knuckles, the small patience of a man deciding whether to look into another man's face. Wolfgang found the tone required. A slightly irritated German abroad, a man disconnected from politics, rich on horses and memory, contemptuous of petty officials, but a friend to order. The tile kept its chill. The guards kept their rhythm. The questions returned like a tide that soaked and retreated, soaked and retreated. Had he worn a ring in a certain photo? How did he know the nephew of a colonel? The smell of disinfectant clung to his tongue. He offered the biography that would save him, and withheld the one that would claim him, and the paper of his statements drank up the ink. Under a skylight that softened the day into a grey soup, he balanced names like plates on sticks, each one spinning, none allowed to clatter. He had a birth soil to claim and a mother to invoke. He had a father's world to borrow for cover, and a new country whose silence now prevailed. Somewhere beyond these walls there was a son with a cinematic laugh, and a wife whose pen traced consolation across thin blue lines, and in each letter's closing flourish a bolt of steadiness threaded through the vagueness imposed by senses. Where do we stop counting covers and begin counting selves? The clink of keys, the damp air, the roughness of paper provided a tactile ledger that he held as if it were a bridle. In his hands, a line. One life or another could be gathered and given slack according to need. The myth kept repeating itself softly. He stayed on his feet. The prison corridor smelled of boiled tea and steel. The footsteps of the guards carried a stale weight. Far down, a faint radio leaked a tune that had no room to dwell, simply passed. Annette stood at a barred door once each permitted week, hands curved around handles worn to a shine by so many before. The bile of fear lived behind her throat, and she learned to flatten it with breath, to lend her voice a colour that would not break him or herself. She wrote on paper so thin the ink bled tiny rivers, yet she wrote anyway, because language soaks and gives, and the act of addressing his name slowed time to manageable intervals. Her perfume had disappeared months ago, her shoes had lost their softness, but pressed in the crease of a letter was a leaf from a tree outside their house, whose smell of sun stored better than sentences. Even held under fluorescent glare, that scent insisted on ordinary life. In another place, a small boy watched home movies projected on a sheet. The film's grain like dust motes the light carried down to the living room floor. A man in a suit laughed at a party. A glass caught the flash. A horse cantered in a tight circle as if it could circle forever. Years later, the boy would listen to a different projector's click, the clicking of archival reels with their rusted edges, and see his father made again and unmade by accounts held in a drawer locked, then unlocked. Some silence came from policy, censorship saved names and flayed myths. Some silence came from kindness, a family making room for air. The projector's bulb heated a plastic smell that intertwined with the woolen smell of blankets on a couch, and the boy put his fingers into the light, letting its warmth measure his own hand's outline. Rediscovery is a soft violence. Brightness can be a kind of hush. The year 1965 saw the arrest. The year 1968 loosened the door in a bitter exchange after a short war, remapped how the air itself felt when you looked out of a window. These numbers are anchor nails hammered into the board to keep the wood from warping under memory's humidity. A guard's voice in the hall had one rhythm, then another. A crowd's breath at a border smelled like pennies and fear. The first sunlight after a long night felt thin and surgical. He carried himself through each threshold with a posture carved by habit, by cavalry etiquette, by the charm that had shielded and exposed him more times than he could count. Back in rooms that hummed with fluorescent quiet and over-papered walls, he debriefed. He measured himself against the other, him, and found both wanting and sufficient. The bottle of champagne opened later, softened nothing and sweetened nothing. It only traced bubbles up a glass, slow as thought. The night quietens. The pages breathe. The city cools its brow. In the briefing rooms where a fan mended the air, notebooks opened and pencils ticked like rain on tin roofs. A chalk hand diagrammed not just routes, but human circuits, where joy erupted in a man's laugh when given a favourite liquor, where boredom nicked at attention like a horsefly, where outrage could be teased into honesty. The rigid doctrine of the subtle grey man loosened, allowing for a silhouette that shimmered rather than vanishing. Fewer trench coats, more linen suits, fewer dead alleys, more crowded verandas, fewer folded arms, more open gestures. Still, each a technique, not an indulgence. Trainees learned to host without being attached, to be generous without feeling owned, to use brightness as a knife with the blade hidden in friendly light. This was a new prose of espionage composed of palette, perfume, place. The old text of clandestine caution did not die. It was annotated, margins filled with a larger hand. The enduring story around him dislodged lazy grooves. Instead of pebbled lanes slicked with rain, his images carried creaking ice buckets, the sugar prickle of fruit on a saucer, the crisp bother of cufflinks at dusk. That text became a syllabus, not a cautionary tale or an anthem, but a plain memorandum of clarity. Sometimes the most seamless disguise is the one that invites the room to lean in. As cadets copied notes under buzzing tubes of light, they tasted the coffee going stale, they heard the pigeons on the sill, and they wrote down the intangible. How to let someone feel special without binding yourself to gratitude. How to prize specificity and let it stand for everything else. A blueprint that includes scent and timbre is not sentimental, it's tactical. The measuring micrometer from our opening extends again, not to paper thickness now, but to how thick a persona can be before it buckles under its own gloss. Diplomatic cables moved with the hiss of a pneumatic universe. the coded language of ministries folding into itself again and again. In one capital, a typewriter clacked with torpid diligence, ribbon smelling of iron and old paste, as officials weighed their liability when their scientists built someone else's menace in someone else's sand. Policies thickened, then thinned. Papers crossed desks under stamps whose dry, powdery pigment flaked into the creases. The same names that toasted to bright projects at one set of tables found their mail watched, their passports bothered by scrutiny, their contracts knotted. The desert workshops felt this dampening as officials far away adjusted valves they never saw, and certain halls lost their echo as conversations migrated into smaller rooms. Here, the value of his work swelled beyond the notes, because what his microdots made visible could be rendered unsightly in the daylight of public scandal. Sometimes pressure feels like policy. It can, instead, smell like old glue. After test sounds quieted and party lights dimmed, courtyards returned to the patient work of vines, their leaves exhaled in the night, a soft sweetness like a bruised fig. Stables mostly returned to stables and stopped carrying such heavy speech. The desert itself resumed its confident drift. Sand lapped the concrete footers and added a layer of forgetting, clinging to bolts, gathering on thresholds, insisting that everything be softened. Not all silence is forced. Some silence comes from awe, a respectful step back from a story so tightly woven that tugging could undo something we do not wish to break. Some silence comes from fatigue, from the body's wish to rest even if the mind still flickers. The myth that the truth always wants out needs to rest too. For generations, mothers hum in kitchens, and the hum enwraps events until the edges fade. You can uncurl them later. You need a gentle room for that. In a lab where a technician's fingers gleam with a sheen of lanolin from handling brittle pages, the letters rest in a tray like fine napkins. Air filters sigh, a static hush. A light table warms the room, and it is on this square sun that the microdots flare from blankness into orderly rows, the dots' crispness resolving into names that slide across your mind with the faint shame of eavesdropping. Modern tools add their own clarity. Spectral analysis of inks, adhesive residue mapped in layers, the ghost of a fingerprint ringed by dust that tastes like nothing and everything. A caliper closes on a margin and opens again. By then, we are measuring not just thickness, but the weight of decisions, who is named, who goes unnamed. The central motif remains kind, not sharp, not a scold, and yet each precise observation is a rung upward. He wanted the paper to carry more than it seemed to. It did. Wind lifts a corner of an old tarp at a long quiet test stand, where concrete heats slowly and cools slowly and has learned to marvel at nothing. Archaeologists of technology step lightly along a pad where weeds push up in stubby green tongues and a lizard flickers across like thought. A notebook flaps under its own weight, leather-scented and familiar. The air still holds a memory of scorched paraffin or burnt paint, not dramatic, just faintly bitter. A bent washer lies half sunk in the dust. A fragment of a nozzle with its baffle pattern corroded to a stippled touch lies beside. Nobody raises their voice. The sight earns whispers by making you very aware of how much sky there is. They sketch, measure, photograph. A breeze brings the smell of river water from a distance. A green ribbon none of this could sever. What remains of the program remains also of him. Not the same, and yet connected through what knowledge made possible. If his lists had not salted the air with caution, would this concrete have witnessed more flame, and for longer? The question comes not to accuse, but to calibrate, the way a hand tests the surface of iron before sitting, sensing if the heat holds. The geometry of power is never purely about capability. It is about who can plausibly explain the thing that is meant or pretend not to see it, and move on. He inserted a fulcrum beneath the narrative of inevitability and pressed until what a nation told itself tilted. Even now, the silence out here is busy. Insects tick in the weeds, boards dry and shrink, and then swell. The ground sifts. In our ears, his parties play again, the soft pop of a cork, the laugh that coaxed the day's stubbornness free. The measurement repeats. How far can a conversation carry across a tiled floor if the room is already listening? Currents of practice changed, still balanced against caution drilled by veterans whose jackets smelled of wool and old tobacco. In classes, students watched recorded scenes and identified tells, the way a gaze locks when pride meets recognition, the way a hand relaxes when a favourite story is invited. Demonstrations showed how an accent softened after 2 drinks on a warm night, or sharpened in a chill morning. Notes grew delicate in a useful way, counting not just facts but tones of those facts, not just places, but the way those places sounded in the mouth of the person who described them. The old tools, dead drops, brush passes, legible codes hidden in nonsense sentences, remained. The new lesson was to generate the kind of conviviality that earns the right to reach across a table without alarm. Human closeness is not a tactic to despise, it is a tool. It glows in candlelight, then folds away when dawn calls. In a white classroom that carried the ghostly scent of chalk, even after chalk was gone, instructors traced arcs of attention on glass boards, while the projector's fan purred quietly like a settled cat. A slide showed a table setting, annotated as carefully as a battlefield photograph, chair angle, line of sight, plate rim catching light, the silhouette of a host's posture, gentle and welcome. Students felt their throats dry slightly as they tried to memorize gestures and also unlearn stiffness. A tray of delicate cups clinked now and then, and that sound became the metronome of the exercise. Knowledge is a diet, you cannot eat a library. He taught that you can, instead, taste the specific and know from it the general, and that the city's breath offers flavors if you hold it in your mouth longer than comfort allows. Learning this art is not a kind of seduction. It is listening with more senses than you say aloud. He moved through later years with an undercurrent of fatigue, learned not from one prison or one party, but from the handwork of being 2 things, or 3, in rooms that smelled of a country pickled vegetables at noon, old rugs in the afternoon, plaster dust, furniture polish, until those scents clung to one identity and had to be washed back off to make room for another. At home, an 8mm projector once heated its small metal heart and streamed a brief summer over faces you could both love and interrogate, and the flicker patterned the ceiling like living tapestry. He would narrate occasionally, with a voice that was careful, then not, then careful again. The pages of draft memoirs gathered in stacks, smelling of newly minted paper and coffee, and at the edge of a photograph, a dog pressed its nose lightly against a child's hand. Silence, here, served reverence. Not every truth wants to be loud. Dust sifts. Fans turn slowly. The glass holds its chill. In some offices beyond his, summary reports weighed 2 contradictions at once and made of that weight the balance of policy. Elsewhere, other flamboyant masks had failed and cost too much. A service learned not to make style its creed. They calibrated. Sometimes grey is the colour of safety. Sometimes gloss is a reflective shield. Disasters came and were suppressed by classification not merely to hide mistakes, but to protect those who might still be in the field, to give breath to missions not yet finished. And sometimes silence owed to a more ordinary accident, a folder misfiled, a box mislabeled in a room that smelled of damp cardboard and long absence. Reverence also sealed lips. A respect for those who ran in place under load, who stretched covers to the tearing point and then stitched them quietly in a safe flat where a kettle rattled. Policymakers listened with pens poised and changed little, everything, and then little again. Back in the climate-controlled archive, the micrometer clicks softly as if remembering. The thin paper sutures decades with its pale tensile strength. The fingertip oil of a long-gone clerk still lives as a faint sheen near the fold. A magnifier light warms the back of a curator's hand. Even now, after layers of story have been applied and then carefully lifted off again like old wallpaper, the hook remains gentle, a measurement of a sheet that carried a dot, that carried a map, that made a ministry choose a different sentence. How can a paper so slight move so much? The answer is not mysterious if you count the specifics, the log-out time at a gate, the boxes that smelled of resin, the freshly greased hinges in a hangar whose echo changed. A myth would deny these modest observations, a place in heroism. His story says, measure once more, then trust what the fingertip finds. At the Island Club, the ledger pages have dried to a stiff velvet, and a card with a thick border shows a name that, to those who mattered then, meant more than horses. The leather of the chair absorbs a sitter's heat at once, then cools, like attention. A waiter's shoes whisper against tile in their soft-soled glide. The silver's weight registers in the forearm as a pleasant ache. He had known this room as a performance space. His plate was not a plate, his napkin not a napkin, they were notes and counters. Outside, a fountain tumbled water over patterned stone, the pulse of a city arranged to please and to blur. He had come to see such places as precious themselves. Each surface introduced a chapter of the story another man wished to tell about himself. The cultivated green, the bent branch, the precise shade of linen, all became a vocabulary. He translated without appearing to translate. A quiet room, nearly dark, hosts a demonstration. On the table, a drop of varnish glints like amber. A pin lifts it. A breath purls across it to cool it quicker. The dot disappears under a stamp, oats, barley, molasses. Then dries. Under the microscope, through a lens that smells faintly like the iris whose aperture it imitates, the tiny grid of a microphotograph sings itself into clarity. The operator's shoulders settle. Names resolve. There is no thrill, only the calm of seeing properly. Even now, this feels like a prayer in a certain tone, simple, specific, grateful for evidence. The myth that espionage demands catastrophe goes thin. The rooms where craft is practiced, taste of dust and light sweat, and the evidence comes to those who pet patience into purring persistence. He placed the dot, others lifted it. Together, these pinhead certainties widened into corridors for policy to walk with a straight back. Breath in. Breath out. The quiet chooses you. Other packages were less polite. Pressure arrived in cardboard that ticked. Men who had once congratulated themselves on usefulness flinched at the ring of the bell. Someone else's hand, not his, applied devices made to frighten and sometimes to scar. And the thread that connected those hands to his desk at a stable was a thin, guilty one lined with justification. A stamp's adhesive lingered on a lip as bitter as worry. The smell of burnt paper is not dramatic, it is mineral and hollow and stays in curtains. People revisited their choices. Secret rooms opened to light not because of virtue, but because of risk. Silence has many parents. Here, silence came later from discomfort, from sober afterthought, from the heavy recognition that even carefully calibrated pressure can shake too much, that letters can do more than invite and inform. He had wanted a conversation to reshape appetite, methods spun beyond his table-setting's circumference. Can a city forgive the taste of fear once it has learned a flavor it did not order? Or does the palate keep a scar no physician can instrument? The question lingers because that taste goes right to the root of what these stories touch. He wore a suit to let others feel secure. He poured to let others pour. He played the warmth of a room as if it were an instrument, not because he was a saint, but because he knew what value bled from coolness into heat and back. The micrometer and the champagne flute lean against one another on a shelf in the mind, the precise beside the celebratory. Not everyone who sat at his table went home untroubled by what they had given away. Yet a smaller dread ranks behind an older, larger dread that rockets teach a nation to learn. He helped the older dread unwind without trumpets. That, too, is a service, not always comfortable to name. After he stepped into quieter years, he took walks where the air salted itself with sea, and the lids of his eyes felt cool. A bench's slats left temporary imprints on his palm. Birds thonging lines above sang without plotting. In a cafe smelling of coffee and furniture polish, he told some pieces to a reporter whose pen liked to linger. Other pieces he saved for a room with a tape recorder whose reels spun patiently and clicked when asked to sleep. Some lines arrived ragged and polished themselves in retelling. Some remained ragged because smoothing them would lie. The house had rooms where family walked barefoot and rooms where shoes stayed on. Different papers lay in different drawers. He put a book on the table eventually. Not a confession, not an exoneration, a chronicle with decent furniture, and it sat there radiating quiet complexity. The glass of water beside its spine held the room's reflected light like a measured solace. At night, readers on sofas inhaled new pages and the dry smell of paper and glue. They saw the lights of Cairo come off the ink, and they thought of a horse's breath fogging in a shaded stall, of the clink of glass and the tenderness of treason performed without hatred. They measured their own reactions and found that sympathy and caution ran muddied, a stream neither clear nor dirty. The myth dimmed. It yields without fuss when invited. Still, it leaves residue. The story revealed the touch of his hand turning a knob at a radio cabinet and the warmth of his guests' closeness. They felt the temperature of the rooms he once hosted, as if stepping into a bath drawn long ago and still somehow warm. At a certain hour, the book closed. The fingertip sensation of the final page's decal stiffened into memory. The lamp turned off softly. The silence did not accuse, it only extended. Without him, a certain arc might have been longer. A certain echo might have echoed more. A certain comfort might have swelled in rooms where planners drank tea and touched a brass teapot's warmed handles. He made the missile rumour domesticated. He made the rumour's fact manageable. This is power in the old definition. The capacity to turn mass and velocity into something you can set down and talk about without your voice shaking. It mattered because he chose a world that shimmered and did not skulk, and in doing so, he expanded the craft's instruments. It mattered because he tied the ribbons of equestrian circles to the heavy cable of policy, and the knot still holds. It mattered because he showed how overlaying a dilettante's gloss on a professional's rigour becomes a cloak that nobody thinks to lift, precisely because it is so obviously silk. Leather, linen, singed wire, ink, the four elements of his method. The sand remembers. The paper lifts. The glass reflects. A micrometer measures a page and finds only thickness. It cannot measure the pressures that lay behind the hand, the alternating weights of courage and appetite, of patience and a certain social radiance. Somewhere, a stable's rafters still hold the sound of swallows, and a ledger's neat cursive still walks its measured line. Somewhere, a test stand catches shadows at the long end of day and does nothing with them. To stand at the intersection of these places in the mind is to hear a faint ringing like a glass stroked by a wet finger. One note holding until it fades, and then the air seems larger for the quiet. The legend of shadow gives way, gently, to the fact of light which he used as carefully as any instrument. The last measurement in this story is unmade by tools. It is made by the part of us that listens gladly and knows when to let a mystery rest. And yet, as the mystery settles, another room offers itself, calm as a held breath. The door's hinges move without protest. Muslin curtains ride the mild swell of night air. A low fan makes the room's heat obedient rather than fierce. On the desk, beside an ashtray that has been cleaned until its glass feels soft to the finger, lies a small leather case with its velvet nap rubbed thin at the hinges. A passport rests inside with creases that have been taught to appear natural. A corner bent and then straightened. The spine worked until the paper fibres lie as if pressed by years of careless pockets. The ink of the entry stamps smells powdery, faintly like schoolroom chalk crossed with nickel. The photo shows a man whose eyes hold ease without insolence, and the shadow of a smile that gives just enough and nothing more. What looks like a document is a room key. What looks like a room key is a door. The life that produced the hand to hold that passport began far from the Island Club's clipped lawns, in a place of tram bells and soot-polished brick, where winter street lamps wore halos and a boy learned to recognize authority by the way footsteps sounded on stairs. Horses there wore blankets in a sharp air whose dryness bit the inside of your nose, and harness bells stitched their own rhythm into tram tracks that hummed under the iron weight of public life. You can imagine his childhood palms reading leather, the way a reader learns to trace lines across an atlas, mapping the feel of surface and the assurance of fit. When he laughed then, it came with the quick release of someone already sensing the stage, hearing voices as weather and weather as news. From the smell of waxed hallway floors to the hush of libraries that promised more than their labels, the boy collected textures that would later become sentences no training manual could quite define. The path to the desert moved south along coasts, where sea air salted sleep, and the shouts of dock workers braided with gulls' complaints. A ship's hold smelled of rope and hemp and grease. An orange sliced on deck at dawn bled bright sugar into the mouths of young men who were all becoming different versions of themselves. Along a shoreline where wind had learned to enter houses without being a guest, he found a place that called itself home with a gentleness that made demands. Early mornings, hands scrubbed raw by buckets, closeness measured not by talk, but by neighbours' shadows slipping across the same floors. Horses again, their eyes slick with intelligence, their breath rising in small clouds on mornings that felt like a promise kept. The long, straight roads of that land taught him another sort of silence, one measured by the call of birds from unseen branches and the clicking of a bridle cheekpiece against a zinc bucket. In that era, a uniform would eventually be fitted. The shoulders would sit right because his posture already did. Mounted training grounds on the edge of the map tasted of iron sand and boiled tea. An instructor's stick, never used cruelly, clicked against a boot heel to remind, not to rebuke. A horse skittered under a sudden gust that carried the smell of distant kitchens. The reins hummed a vibration back into his bones, and he learned what it meant to sit deep and give the animal an argument it could accept. In another building nearby, a radio that ran on valves warmed slowly to a red-orange glow, and a gloved hand adjusted a dial with a delicacy he would come to appreciate in another life. Down the corridor, telephones of black bakelite waited in a line, their cords heavy, their bells modest and insistent. Discipline felt like a rhythm, and the day's sequence laid itself across his muscles like a song you rehearse until forgetting it becomes impossible. He learned to read men the way he read horses, which eyes held stubbornness, which hands held grace, which words were only a cover for a hope. War does not always announce itself as catastrophe. Sometimes it arrives as a difference in air pressure that you feel in the inner ear before you register the sound. The desert took armoured shapes that bit at the horizon and passed like weather, leaving aftertastes of rubber and hot oil, and the sudden, relief-heavy laughter of men who found a moment to act ordinary. In kitchens near field hospitals, kettles filtered water into a memory almost sweet. The tents smelled of canvas warmed to a patient heat, a smell that would, for the rest of one's life, act as its own passport back to a brief hour of rest under a sky culled by wind. Radios whispered as if not to wake the sand, code tapped in careful sequences that married sound to intention. A pencil erased to stubs lay beside a ledger of message traffic, and fingers dusted with eraser crumbs grew their own quiet calluses. If ambition is a map, he learned to fold it so that two places touched. From uniform to civvies, the pivot felt less like a divestment than like dressing a new instrument in old clothes. A quiet office where salt found its way into the wood from men who still carried the sea in their throats, a smell of new paper and old glue, and a question that was not a demand. Would he like to bring together the knack of horses and the timbre of speech and the practice of not frightening people when you needed them to be unguarded? The desk at which this question was asked bore a blotter whose leather had been fed until it held a shine only lamplight could make honest. A typewriter waited with its carriage aligned, a wastebasket held nothing. Beside, a small padded envelope lay, innocuous, with a set of rings inside that a jeweller had scratched to the right degree of imperfection, each a small shining proof that identity is an art of patience. He tried each on and felt the way they weighted gestures he already knew how to perform. The cover's skin thickened by layers as conscientious as leaves laid down in a forest. There was a watch with a face slightly too old for fashion, but just right for someone who professed to have known a better era. There were shoes with soles crisp enough to suggest money not often walked, but a scuff added in the right place to declare the owner knew real earth. There was a manner of greeting that borrowed from messes where rank is recognized before warmth, and from parlours where warmth is currency. He went to a tailor who spoke with pins in his mouth and measured him by eye twice before using the tape itself carrying a faint perfume of soap and clean cotton. He ordered cards embossed with a name made to sound both distinguished and suffered. The card's edges flashed lightly when tilted in sun. The stable he would speak of in Cairo could be made factual in a day if anyone pressed. Documents lay ready in a drawer lined with felt. The luggage passed through customs with the lazy rhythm of a river that had seen more worlds than the men who stood by it and stamped. Porters carried cases whose weight hid more paper than clothes, though the clothes themselves bore the smell of good closets. The taxis that met him along the city's edge were painted in colours chosen to keep heat and brand memory. Their seats radiated a vinyl warmth softened by wear. Their dashboards displayed talismans against capricious fate. The road along the river offered him a city that knew how to reflect itself. Bridges oiled by footsteps, lampposts wearing their own chipped lineage, kiosks where papers shouted in a dozen voices over coffee that carried cardamom like a friendly argument. Horses at the racecourse moved like bright punctuation across the grammar of grass. Voices in the stands layered the German of distant schools with Arabic's music and French's fluted precision. When he spoke the first day, his vowels knew how to hold a warm room. The first answer came with an ease he pretended to find expected. Registration at the Island Club passed under portraits that had dimmed gracefully. The ink in the ledger made slow curves that steadied the soul. A man behind the desk, not young, handled the membership book with both duty and affection. His stamp landed with authority softened by convivial pride. That first afternoon, a host brought a tray with an arrangement of glass that had learned, across centuries of service, to make water look like a promise. He let his shoulders relax at the right time. He joked lightly with the garden's gardener about the virtues of different soil mixtures for saplings that later would give shade to people who would not remember the heat that raised them. He watched the way older men entered rooms, whether they leaned on sticks because their legs demanded it or because sticks made a certain statement about dignity, which is its own kind of instrument. He made sure he stood just long enough when wives entered. The carousel of dinners began, and with each orbit the table set itself as an apparatus tuned to human signal. Candles were chosen not for romance, but for their unsteady flame, which reveals more than a fluorescent tube ever will. Micro shifts of eyes, a knuckle easing, the appetite for another story bubbling from a guest's throat when their wine ran low. Flowers, yes, but never heavy scent. That would mask the room's instrument panel of perception. The napery felt under the hand like a promise kept. The chairs were comfortable just beyond politeness, so that lingering felt deserved. He asked after families in a manner that carried knowledge without weight. He told a story about an auction in a cold hall where the steam from horses' nostrils recorded the day's numbers, like ledger lines in air. He described the feeling of a program man's hands, always dry and smooth, they're callous. A thin band at the base of the fingers from drawing diagrams more than from tools. Laughter arrived when invited and left before anyone noticed it had overstayed. He learned which gate guards wore new boots by the sound of their footfalls. He learned which truck drivers preferred songs to whistles and which would listen to the shape of silence rather than fill its gap. The city's mechanics shared a vocabulary of stains and solvent, and he soaked that vocabulary like bread in broth, softening it until it could be swallowed without chewing. He did not collect facts as stamps, he acquired relationships with facts. There was a contractor whose laugh would become a cough when trying not to say a name. There was a clerk whose pride in having the right ink for stamped export forms encouraged a confession about a shipment delayed for lack of a bolt measured in a country that renamed the measurement 3 times in the last generation. He used what the day gave. On his desk, a paper from a feed supplier carried a careful signature, and nested within its flourish, a world. Tradecraft asked him to be either seen or unseen according to a plan, but he was working in an age and a corner of the world where being seen was the cloak. He allowed himself to be photographed at places where sunlight could not behave. The glare behind him hid the deepest lines of his face, and allowed a newspaper to print his presence without offering it up to analysis. He gave interviews by the pool only when a gust fanned the water so that reflections broke into fragments. The ripples turned any attempt at reading his eyes into a pretty futility. He visited stables during the heat lull, when even officials felt forgiven for inattention, and he had a way of listening to a man whose mother tongue differed from his, and being the one to feel grateful afterward. Whispered introductions crept up to him as moths do to a lamp, not because he burned, but because he allowed light to rest on other people. The hidden correspondence moved as a blood system moves, quiet, regular, mostly unnoticed when it's working its best. A pigeon's feather in a hallway was only a feather. To him, its position relative to a seam in plaster said a time had changed by 30 minutes. A stick of gum placed under a bench, brand and number of folds marking a letter to come or a danger already past, smelled youthfully of artificial mint, a small comedy that made vigilance friendlier. The devices he chose rarely whined with modernity. They preferred the anonymity of household good looks. A kitchen clock that ran 10 minutes fast for everyone else kept for him a separate time. Its back held space for a sliver of film and a slip with a number that would look like an insult to an uninitiated eye. The camera that flattened information into a dot clicked no louder than a spoon touching the rim of a teacup. At night, a wire on a rooftop listened to the sky. He adjusted his breathing to match a room. Signals travelled not only through airways but through habits. He always refilled a glass before it asked. He always let a conversation land in someone else's lap and then be lifted again by a different hand. He always left one good question untouched on the table, warm and ready for next time. Men returned because being understood is a narcotic that never gets a warning label. He appraised small gifts with the attention of a curator. A cigar whose wrapper bore a certain leaf pattern suggested a supplier with a different supplier whose wife was a friend to the wife of a man whose workday ended near a fence that guarded something iron. A dull boy given to boasts became a compass, his needle jerking with vanity, his true north. Whatever would let him say a bigger sentence than his last. Gossip is always fuel. He filtered it through a mesh that only patience can weave tight. The fragments he kept did not cut, they locked. Beyond his apartment's walls, the city's back rooms held their own algorithms. Offices not unlike those he had passed through as a younger man now bent their attention toward the same thin threads his messages described. Cautious of the moral hazard of being right, wary of the diplomatic hazard of being loud. A teletype in a capital far north of the desert sweated ink on a tape that curled at its edges. The tape drifted into a tray with a cluck that had, over generations, come to mean seriousness. Men and women bent with coffee cooling at their right hands read words that turned desert projects into domestic headaches. Committees convened under high ceilings to discuss what it meant when citizens were working in other people's sand toward other people's sand, toward other people's fear. Voices softened, not out of kindness, but to keep important things from falling off the table when the table shook. Sand carried across oceans as dust on policy. It settled in the lungs of civic conversation. Not all instruments of pressure belonged to him or to the rooms he reported to. In a separate corridor of the same institution, letters left the post uninvited by decency, their insides engineered to punish the very men he drank with. The package's construction smelled of solder and insomnia. At their destination, when the paper split, outrage also burst, filling vacuums they had not foreseen. He read of harm in the most neutral language the press could manage. then pressed his thumb into a pocket where the cloth had worn thin, feeling a friction that had nothing to do with heat. He kept hosting, because to stop would signal fear, and fear is a trumpet you cannot easily mute. Those other methods complicated his art. They kept his guests' eyes jumping to doorways at every knock. They reminded him that he worked within a web he did not control. Conscience is not a single knot, it is the entire net, flexing. What a city learns over a season remains on its tongue. The clubs grew a thin second skin of unease. Glass clinks registered a stutter. A driver folded his newspaper with an extra crease near the ad for horses. He calibrated again. Fewer jokes planned and more offered spontaneously to rebalance a room. He let silence do slow work and put away one or two sharpnesses. Outside a test gate, guards began to check faces more carefully. A contractor, whose temper had been part of his charm, now wore it like armour. He watched and adjusted, the way a rider lengthens stirrups when the ground softens and shortens when the horse needs the leg close and unmoving. His frequencies changed, his dot-carrying papers left through routes that involved fewer predictable points. His most reliable courier became the care he took with his own presence. A mask that cannot breathe must be lifted at the edges. He feathered them, slow as liking. The day a van idled too long outside his building, and then idled again the day after, and looked the same. His skin answered before his mind did. He sent a guest away earlier than habit. He pretended to remember an appointment he had not made with a tailor. He walked the stairs down, not up, and took a different door that had taught his hand, the comfort of its older brass. Streets he knew by the sound of morning now spoke a late afternoon dialect, more echo, lower key. A young man in a brown jacket leaned against a truck bed, not smoking, his hands folded as if waiting for bread, but watching windows instead. There is a moment when recognition becomes not a thought, but a direction. And you cannot stop moving, because the air behind you has filled with the things you do not want to name. When the knocking came, it was almost courteous. The door made the sound of a book closing. Someone said his cover name and left a terrible kindness in the tone. Rooms set aside for questions do not require cruelty to be effective. Their geometry does that work. A table too bright, a chair slightly wrong for a back that likes to sit straight, an aroma of disinfectant that seems to have washed the walls clean of their own past. The engineering of attention. He pulled close to a version of himself that had worked before, nudging the German's vanity into business. An official could understand and dismiss. Paper asked him to repeat. The repetition carved grooves he knew better than to follow completely. He offered details that kept secrets rather than trapping them. He made his ignorance taste plausible, and his knowledge taste like the sort that came to a man who does not bother with officers. He accepted sugar in his tea and let the clink of the spoon against the glass become a metronome for the pace of his answers. The guard's boots squeaked on tile only when boredom made them heavy. He watched for boredom the way a sailor reads sky. Failure in this work is often a slow contagion that begins with a single unavoidable breath. A radio is found, and not because a man betrayed a friend, but because a van with a loop on its roof listened too many nights in a city that had learnt to listen back. He did not deny the radio. Denial would make a nonsense out of the rest of him. He arranged his story around the instrument in a pattern that rephrased intent into novelty, a rich man's toy with a reach beyond propriety, an era of curiosity. They tasted this and decided the spice. He swallowed the dish offered. There were handcuffs that were not tight, which is a different kind of control. There was transport in a vehicle that made of his face a mirror of other faces behind bars, all of them reflecting one another into a quiet multiply. He counted doors and ventilation grates and memorized the shape of the front seat's upholstery seam, not because escape was likely, but because knowing measures fear like a scale, measures fruit. Letters out and letters in found their way into cruel folds of possibility. His wife stood where she could be seen and heard, because a system had designed that as the only location where compassion could be measured without upsetting balance. She wrote in a hand that held the spine of things. She replaced perfume with patience and allowed her words to walk the length of paper with a dignity that taught time not to run. At permitted moments, she revised the ritual of domestic attention into something the corridor could not break. She smoothed his shirts as if ironing the hours could flatten them enough to fit through a gate. She pressed, once, a leaf between paper as if scent could argue with the fluorescent. It argued enough to keep a corner of the day safe. He took those letters into a place behind his sternum and made of them a cool seat on a veranda no one could confiscate. Even guards respect the architecture of love when it builds in silence. The trade made later to lift him out of those halls did not need trumpets. It required engines and caution, and the choreography of men who had spent a lifetime making sure their jackets hung right and their voices matched their faces. A strip of land whose gravel had been ground to powder by all the trucks that had crossed it smelled of cedar sap from crates and fear's coppery breath. The exchange happened in brisk phrases that would, in other rooms, make small talk. The hands that touched his arms were firm and unsurprised. He found himself within hours in a space whose cleanliness was an insult to all the grit he had taught his body to welcome, and he allowed himself the exquisite fatigue of a man who has no job but to let his bones regain their surprise at soft chairs. The fruit set before him tasted outrageously alive. He laughed with a quiet that shook. Debriefing belongs to a different category of hospitality. The rooms carried coffee that made better company than any of them could be at the hours they met. Pencils of a certain pencil maker had learned to keep their points longer than cheap ones. The sharpeners did not scream, the paper felt good under the hand. He told it in order, and then again out of order, and then in a mosaic that allowed the listeners to assemble their own order if they preferred. He was not protecting secrets from them, he was protecting the truth from exhaustion. Maps unrolled made a domestic sound like rugs being shaken outdoors, and pins went in with a delicacy that would have made a dressmaker proud. He added scent and temperature and the way the light lay in rooms, because these things are the rails on which events move. The listeners wrote down not merely what, but how. Their pencils registered a phenomenon that a technical language can flatten until it loses its weight, a human map. His name became a file identifier, and a case study title, and a story told at tables where younger colleagues learned how to sit and how to keep their own hands from telling on them. He did not always attend, he did not need to. The lessons lifted themselves from his habits like steam from a bowl. They condensed on the cool steel of doctrine and ran into channels that were new. A training hall put out on trestles. A reproduction of a dining table from a climate like Cairo's. Chairs were misaligned on purpose. A faint fan hum supplied the necessary acoustic. Students rolled their shoulders and attempted to relax without losing alertness. Under the lens of a handheld camera, a small dot opened again. And this time the names on the grid offered themselves as theatre props for a bigger action, not a performance, but a conversation that made policy tilt. He watched a new generation learn to treat friendliness as a professional-grade material, rather than as a complement to personality. The ripples his reporting set out along the world's corridors found themselves shaping decisions in rooms he never entered, in buildings that smelled of new paint and old coffee. Investigations far from the Nile opened files on men who had believed the desert's wideness protected their intentions from scrutiny at home. Parliamentary questions sprouted in a winter air that smelled of damp wool and coal smoke, and the answers felt under the tongue like excuses shaped too carefully to be trusted. Contracts dissolved not because they were illegal, but because they had become impolite to sustain. A newspaper headline that avoided melodrama carried a weight that melodrama could not. In academies where engineering had long taken its head from clouds and put it into propellants, students felt the slow heat of public interest and pulled their collars a little away from their necks. As these currents moved, hangers elsewhere quieted and lay down their echoes for a season. He returned to himself as a man lives in a house long enough to forget which furniture came with it and which he carried in. And then one day he sits and asks where he truly lives. The sea helped with this question by being honest without being cruel. It offered surface, depth, and the place in between, where light is a negotiator. Morning walks along a promenade, worn smooth by other feet, taught him forgiveness. He could find nowhere in a file. He passed a bakery whose ovens had made witnesses of the same walls for decades. The smell of bread pooled and softened, and he let it. He wrote in notebooks that did not demand to be read. He piled them in stacks on a shelf that gave gently under the load. He told stories to the version of his son that sat most often at his side, and those stories learned how to accept their own limits. He allowed himself a dog's straightforward affection and a neighbour's polite indifference, and felt both as gifts. The book that bore his name did its quiet work. A stranger opened it, as others had opened obedient doors for him, and found within a tone that refused to be either apologetic or triumphant. Pages smelled of a binder's glue that could not bear damp, and still a few were closed over by a thumb wet with tea. Readers came to his rooms and went again. They stood for a moment in the doorway, surprised by how ordinary a lamp can be when you have expected it to hold more light. He gave interviews that allowed silence between answers, as if he were holding out a plate and waiting for the room to decide what it wanted to put on it. He refused to recast himself as someone doomed or blessed. He took the weight of specifics, measured it, and set it down where it would be safe for decades. In lecture halls of later eras, the artifacts of his time took on the affectionate patina history, gives objects that behaved themselves well under stress. A reel-to-reel's wobbly spindles spun and stopped. A student lifted the lid on a tape recorder and smiled with the tenderness that old mechanisms command when they offer their secrets plainly. The leather on a passport's spine cracked in a way that let sunlight gild the damage. A finger ran across it as a priest might run his hand along a rail polished by hope. Miniature images bloomed under projectors that now used cold LEDs rather than hot bulbs, and the slightest motor noise, misinterpreted as intimacy, filled the room. A lesson scrolled past on a screen, and in a corner, a bulleted list suggested that hospitality was not merely a human virtue, but a field skill. The room's air had a modern nowhere scent, and still, the bodies within it warmed the instruments and took from them a discernible breath. Some future students, leaning forward with elbows on desks, understood his work not because their world matched his, but because people still chew and laugh and change their voice when they feel seen. The substitutes for his tools had changed. Microdots ridden into adhesive films became images folded into pixels and stuffed into the noise of other files. The dead drops hid less often in walls, and more often in the layered cosmos of communication where addresses never use the same name twice. Yet the table, the cup, the posture, these survived translation. On nights in cities different from Cairo, where neon makes rain look like ink that wants to be read, they held small gatherings and practiced asking questions that did not feel like questions. They learned to polish their curiosity until it reflected the other person, and in that reflection they found maps still good. A stable in another country, decades older than those he'd known, continued its calm labour. Saddles on wooden stands, stitching repaired by hands that had trained under hands now dust. The smell of tallow and sun-warmed plank, and the same old rhythm of two hearts learning one another without betrayal. A memory of him reached here without force, because horses remember posture and tone, and the hand that respects the line between firm and kind. A groom flicked a towel across a bay's flank, and the hair shone under the electric light the way it had under paraffin. The animal stamped and relaxed, its eye soft. Someone told the story in the tack room while tying a knot that would never be in a textbook, a knot that another hand can unfasten in the dark with trust. The listening did not increase the horse's calm, but it increased the human future for a few minutes, a trade as valuable as any memo. At a test stand that now served as a curiosity for engineers who loved the clean edges of the past, wind-curled powdered dust into lazy snakes. A sign warned of nothing new. The concrete wore its history lightly, a platform that had once shaken and had, since then, learned to love stillness. Beneath a patch of weeds, A binder clip pressed into dirt reached a thin metal arm toward memory. A student pried it out and held it to the light as if it contained a story, and then he put it back down with a politeness that kept the ground's grammar intact. The sound of river water reached this place from beyond the hum of distant traffic, a green memory that always outlasts concrete. He would have approved that the young people there spoke in a low tone even before a librarian told them to. Diplomacy in later seasons referenced his impact without naming it, the way a family recipe's improvement refuses attribution. Where once there were comfortable certainties, now there were footnotes. Where once an official could smile and call engagement normal, now a pause arrived before the second word. Scientific conferences in hotels whose carpets smell of permanent maintenance grew small absences. Experts who would have come now stayed away. Panels rebuilt themselves around what was present rather than what had been expected. The city that had held him recalibrated what invitations meant. It grew a slight caution's grace, and that grace made some boasts unwearable. In capitals that had hosted silence, archivists added to boxes the pieces he had made necessary, memos that explained a caution taken, minutes that recorded a hand raised to ask whether a certain project deserved a different shade of attention. History's clock does not only mark time, it measures the weight of pauses. In a museum that celebrated human cunning, a case held his bottle and his radio side by side, asking visitors to join a conversation across objects. The bottle's punt had collected dinner light. The radio's ridged bakelite had once held the warmth of a hand at 3 a.m. A caption avoided drama and gave dates by the gentler language of "in that era" and not long after the short war. And the quiet precision of the text made the exhibit's space itself feel like a confession that had found its right volume. Children pressed their hands against glass as children do. The exhaled fog made halos around the instruments, and the pairs of eyes that looked through the condensate repeated a condition of his work, the need to see beyond. Home for him remained less a place than a cadence. He ate the same breakfast for days and then changed it the way a careful rider shifts weight before a turn. He kept one chair near a window reserved for weather, not for anyone's body, and the light that entered there obligingly changed across the hours, telling him without words that he was still living in a world that knows how to turn and how to return. Friends called with stories that did not require him to solve anything. Some of these arrived with the trivial joys of the day. An apricot that had no right to be so sweet. A shoemaker who had refused to increase his price because he liked the shape of a client's gratitude. He attended a wedding and a funeral and stood at the edge at both, letting ceremony handle the main burden while he handled the small, important things, handing tissues, directing older hands to cooler water, translating the way the air felt into what a child could bear. At odd hours, he found himself in the archive again, though not physically. His memory drifted along the regulated aisles of his own past, pulling down a box not out of need, but out of a wish to smell a time. He lifted a paper in his mind and felt its edge. The tiny burr caught his imagination, the way a microdot once caught a handler's blade. He sat with this, and then placed it back without fuss, aligning the corners, preserving the order he had fought to maintain, when order would have been the first to leave. He may have smiled at his former self, not condescendingly, but with the fondness one keeps for a younger man who loved clean shirts and clean floors in a dirty line of work. It is not that he forgave himself, it is that he realized the proper size of forgiveness. It is domesticated, a small dog that sits and waits without demand. When news reached him of the city he had once held in the cup of his body, it came as a scent and a rhythm even before the words formed. He could tell which breath spoke of a chill in government rooms and which spoke of heat on crowded streets. He recognized the temper of a headline by the paper's audacity with font. He heard in the laughter of a reporter when a story broke, whether the story was grief or relief. The afterlife of espionage is an ear tuned to whether others consider merely cloudy or merely bright. He closed the newspaper quietly and put it under his plate to keep it flat. He ate slowly and let a fragment of fruit burn the tongue to remind the day that living down to the last nerve ending is a kind of gratitude. An apprentice to the discipline he had complimented wrote him a letter, once with the formality of a student addressing a master. The paper was thick, too thick for such a message, and the handwriting proper to ceremonial occasions. The young man believed he was saying something weighty because of the weight of his pen strokes. He wrote of admiration and utility, and the way a case like Lotz's gave form to ambitions in corridors of the service. The reply, when it came, suggested a different size to things. He thanked the writer for his courtesy, and then advised him to make a good cup of coffee before each meeting, and to learn to let go of a question if the question did not feel like a gift. He advised him to rest before the party, not after. He advised him to find a stable in any city and stand in it once a month and breathe quietly until the world forgot him again. He told him to keep a napkin in his breast pocket and not to speak until he knew whether he would need it for his guest or for himself. There were nights when the sky above his building performed more than usual. Airplanes climbed and turned with their belly lights appearing, then blinking, then dissolving into black. A satellite moved as plainly as purpose. Once, at an unremarkable hour, the horizon flared with an event too distant to be dangerous, too present to ignore. He stood and wondered if someone else, somewhere else, was listening to him the way he had once listened to others. If someone else had gathered fragments from the tone of engines and the colour of a flare, and would write a line that would one day enter a file, and that file would be carried by a person whose shoes would squeak on tile, and who would sit and face a man to ask him to retell until they both were exhausted, and then they would both be left with the remarkable nothing of a room after a long conversation. His breath slowed. He let the night do its own work. In a photograph taken without ceremony, he sits at a table with rough wood and holds in his hand the stem of a modest glass with an unpolished base. The drink within not at all a symbol, just a small pleasure. The line of his chin tells you he is listening. The crease at his eye tells you he is allowing himself to be astonished by something ordinary. A coat behind him hangs on a peg without worry. A hat lies on the table, brim up and receives light like a small bowl. There is nothing to decode except the obvious. A man left with his head and his hands. A pair of tools that have learned to work together until one's movement looks like the other's intention. The room accepts him. The photograph's edges have gone soft with handling by people who did not know him, and made of the image something like affection for a person who did hard things without hardening. And there were gardens that did not care about any of it. Plants rose into their architectures of sugar and thirst. A hose lay with its coils catching light. A bench remembered old men who had told stories on it, and then stopped telling stories, and then ceased to come. He sat in such a garden and let his fear go for a walk and returned less sure of itself. He noticed ants negotiating a bump in the dirt and wondered at their ability to live within inches of danger and inches of pleasure without storing an opinion about either. He found a place in the shade where he could see a slice of river and a wedge of sky and one corner of a building he had once entered under a different name. His body eased into the chair as one eases into a borrowed tub, politely. He brought a book that had nothing to do with his life and everything to do with being alive. The pages carried a story of weather and a woman and a field of grain. He let the wind do the work. For those who came later and answered their own summons to the same kind of work, his legacy was more than action points and cautionary notes. It was a mood properly adopted. He demonstrated that softness can hold shape. He proved hospitality can be structured, measured, and directed without becoming ugly. He reminded rooms that the weight of a name in a ledger might be heavier than the mass of a rocket's casing because people choose based on how they understand themselves, make a person feel like a picture they want to live inside, and they will invite you to sit while they take off the frame. From stables to salons to interrogation rooms to beaches where low waves talk at a volume never exceeding a whisper, he stayed attuned to the ordinary as the straightest line through event and consequence. He did not save everything. He made the universe smaller where it needed to be, for long enough to prevent one kind of folly from getting bigger. In another archive, in another city, a curator turns a page with a gloved hand and reads a line that brings him into the room with us again. The glove squeaks faintly against the paper, an intimacy the page would never allow. Naked skin. The eye collects the small joy of finding handwriting that improves as it goes, as if the writer's muscles had remembered their old love of making marks. The sentence says nothing spectacular. It notes a luncheon rescheduled due to a delivery of oats, but it sits in a constellation of other sentences that, taken together, explain why a certain sequence did not occur. The curator breathes, and the page, limned by flat light, does not mind. Outside, ordinary shoes take ordinary steps over ordinary floors, and the building holds within it the cool of 1,000 quiet days. The story rests. The man within it has rejoined the category of those we speak of kindly and do not disturb when the room grows light. They say that stones keep the heat of the day and release it slowly after evening cools. If you sit by a wall built to mark a boundary between gardens and consider what it means that a single person can carry the weight of a course correction without crushing his own spine, you may begin to feel also that the air owes us nothing and gives us everything we ask for properly. His life asks us to hold two things at once, the righteousness of caution and the humility of method. You can trace a finger along a list of names and hospitals and offices and clubs until you reach the place where you stop because the page ends, and then you can turn it, and there is more. What you do after turning matters. He taught turning as an art, not abrupt, not slow, timed to the step of a horse or the breath of a guest or the pulse of a city. He turned his head when the room sang to him in a key he knew, and turned again when it sang in a key he needed to learn. At the end, there is the quiet test of whether a life has thrown a useful shadow. The stable that remembers his hand says yes. The rooms where deputies revised memoranda say yes. The families who were spared, a later dread, say yes without knowing they have said it. The city that held him has grown in ways he could have predicted, and in ways that would have made him laugh. It carries a familiar midnight and a different dawn. The craft he served has moved through tools and beyond them, and then back to them again. Every generation forgets the softness, and then one person like him reminds them in a voice that does not raise itself. We sit with this, and the hour passes not with drama, but with a relaxing breath. The last possession he would want kept on his behalf is not a radio or a dot or a card. It is the memory of the way he sat at a table and made room, and how that room, once made, altered the map. The sand holds, the paper lies flat, the glass offers back a face. If we listen with the part of ourselves that is older than our first worry, we can hear the city shift weight and settle. He is there, not trapped in legend or rescued by protest, but living in that exact middle where his hands and his head did their quiet, durable work. We step away, not to leave him, but to let the chair cool. The room stays gentle. The story continues to do what it was meant to do. Teach by example, persuade without coercion, warm the air by a fraction, and lift the corners of a life so that light can go